name is Dr. Vernon Williams. I am a sports neurologist by training. I am a member of the California State Athletic Commission. My practice is with the Curlin Jobe Orthopedic Clinic, and I direct the Curlin Jobe Center for Sports Neurology and Pain Medicine.
What is a concussion?
A concussion is any abnormality in neurologic function and how the brain is working that results from some biomechanical force. And it can be a force to the body or the head. It does not require loss of consciousness. But if there's some change in how the brain is working, and that normally results in things like headache, or things like problems with memory, or problems with balance, or problems with vision, certainly a knockout counts as well. Any of those things is considered a concussion. We tend to think that it largely has to do with how the brain is working, rather than some structural damage or structural injury. That's another kind of traumatic brain injury. Concussions are normally functional in nature, although as we're starting to learn with advanced imaging, we can see some very, very mild structural changes even in what we used to call and typically call traditional concussion. But a concussion is some change in how the brain is working as a result of some biomechanical force that's been absorbed by that athlete.
What symptoms will you feel with a concussion?
Probably the most common symptom associated with concussion is headache. Probably 85 to 90% of people who have a concussion will have headache as part of their symptom complex. Beyond that, it can vary from person to person. Some people will have amnesia or loss of memory. Some people will have dizziness or loss of balance. Some people may have visual changes, and that can be blurry vision, or it can be partial loss of vision. And then there are other changes that can come on as well. People can have difficulty with their sleep. They can have mood disturbances. So there are a number of different symptoms that can come along with concussion. They can vary from person to person. One thing that's really critically important is that sometimes people can still be suffering from the effects of a concussion even though they don't feel the symptoms anymore. So that's why we've transitioned to using more objective tests and objective ways of evaluating the brain and the nervous system, so we can figure out, is that concussion still present or has it completely resolved?
When should you stop heavy sparring before an event?
We believe that it's probably best to stop heavy sparring at least 2 weeks prior to an event. From a performance standpoint, if heavy sparring results in some concussive injury or even some subconcussive injury, the brain just doesn't work as well as it normally would when it's been injured. So you won't be as good an athlete as you could be if you're suffering from subconcussive blows from heavy sparring or an actual concussion that may result from heavy sparring. Your reaction times will be off, you'll be slower, your speed of mental processing may be off, your vision, your balance may be off. You won't compete as well as you could in the ring at your event if one of those things is present. A subconcussive blow has caused some change in brain function or an actual concussion has occurred. The other thing we think about has to do with safety, and that is really critically important. We know that if the brain has been concussed and you suffer a second concussion, the results are far more severe than they would be otherwise. So the better part of valor is to make sure that the brain has completely healed from any concussive or subconcussive blows prior to the event. And that will dramatically reduce the risk of really catastrophic injury that can occur if you've been sparring too heavily, too close to the event.
How long after a concussion can you resume sparring?
There's a couple of things to think about in that regard as well. One is that if you think about other sports, football, hockey, soccer, we would never allow athletes to return to play until their symptoms have been completely resolved. In other words, if they've had any headaches or dizziness or lightheadedness or what have you, that's all been resolved. But we also require that objective tests show that their brain is working properly again. That hasn't necessarily been the case in combat sports, but there is a real movement for us to include those same kinds of criteria with combat sports. We want to be able to prove that your brain is working properly before you go back to activities that could put you at risk. When we do that, we reduce the risk of another concussion, we reduce the risk of a catastrophic injury like bleeding in the brain, and we also reduce the risk of long-term consequences. So there's really two pieces to the issue of return to sparring. Part of it has to do with the complete resolution of symptoms. Part of it has to do with being able to show objectively that the brain is working properly again. And there are different tests that can be done to do that. Traditionally, if there's been a knockout or TKO, there have been some specific requirements that the state makes in terms of when you can return. That's critical as well. But we're starting to add these other pieces of information, like objective information related to how the brain is working.
What is a subdural hematoma?
A subdural hematoma is probably one of the most dangerous and feared aspects of combat sports. And this is when there's a collection of blood that develops between the layer of the brain called the dura mater and the brain tissue itself. Now, when that happens, it can cause a significant increase in pressure within the brain. It can cause damage to key and vital neurological structures, and it can cause death. So it's a really critical and potentially catastrophic and fatal complication of brain injury. If anyone in their camp, other stakeholders surrounding that fighter see those kinds of things after sparring or after an event, they should be brought to the attention of medical personnel. So if something like a subdural hematoma is present, it's recognized immediately and they can seek medical attention.
What is the golden hour in relation to neurological trauma?
The time period between an injury to the brain, like a subdural hematoma or an epidural hematoma, and that athlete receiving medical attention. It turns out that as time goes on, with pressure being increased within the brain, and sometimes the actual size or volume of the bleed gradually increasing, there's more and more damage being done to the brain. What we understand now is that there can be a point reached where that damage becomes irreversible. We know that if we can get to that athlete and get them neurosurgical attention immediately, they have the best chance of survival. That golden hour is critical because it's thought that if medical care isn't sought prior to that first hour, then it's much more likely that the damage is irreversible and that the athlete will eventually succumb to that injury. So time is of the essence. Every minute counts. If there's any evidence of something like a subdural hematoma or epidural hematoma, worsening a neurological condition, we want to get medical attention immediately because that really significantly improves the likelihood of survival.
How is dehydration related to neurological health?
Pretty much every system in the body works poorly if the body is dehydrated. The brain is no exception. So if we talk about the brain being perhaps our most important tool, our most important weapon as a combat sports athlete, why would we want slower reaction times? Why would we want a slower speed of mental processing, altered vision, imperfect balance, and all of those things that do happen with dehydration if we're competing? You want to compete and be at your best. Dehydration absolutely has a negative effect on pretty much every neurological function that you can name. So dehydration is bad not only for your kidneys and for your heart, but it's bad for your brain. And most critically, perhaps, is the fact that dehydration can increase the risk of one of these potentially catastrophic injuries like a subdural hematoma, like bleeding in the brain. And so it is bad for the brain in every way imaginable.
How do concussions and neurological trauma relate to quality of life in later years?
We know that in retired professional athletes, there is a correlation between the number of concussions they've sustained and the likelihood that they develop some kind of chronic neurologic impairment. That can be dementia, that can be depression, that can be Parkinsonism. There are a number of things that can happen. But what we know is that there does seem to be a correlation between the number of concussive events an individual has sustained during their professional career and the risk or likelihood of those long-term neurologic problems. Now, that's part of the reason we feel it's so important to monitor and survey neurologic health across the lifespan. We want to be able to collect objective information. We want to be able to follow how an athlete is performing relative to their vision and their balance and their reaction time and their cognitive function. And if we see any evidence of something that's concerning, then we can alert that athlete. We can also train different parts of the brain so that we can help to overcome deficits that may be developing. There's lots of research being done looking at ways to prevent these chronic neurologic disorders that can happen. But this is something of concern. It's something that we're all taking a look at.
If a fighter receives a 30-day no-contact suspension, can he or she resume light sparring before that time is over?
This is a rule. We don't want any contact prior to that 30-day suspension. We don't want to hold you out 1 minute longer than we need to. We want you to be able to participate. We want you to be able to perform. We know this is your livelihood and this is what you do and you have reasons for that. We want to make sure that it's safe. And so when we talk about suspensions, when we talk about periods of time that we need to rest the brain, the reason for that is that if the brain isn't rested, if there is repeat injury to the brain prior to healing, the risks of some of these long-term consequences and some of the short-term or immediate catastrophic injuries is much, much higher.
What is the Commission's new C3 Logics neurological testing system and how will it be utilized?
What C3 Logics does is it allows us to check cognitive function, how you're thinking, what your memory is like, that kind of thing. It allows us to test vision, and that's both static and dynamic visual acuity. It allows us to test balance, and it allows us to check reaction times. So as we collect that kind of information, we're getting information about how the brain works. And we know athletes are critically concerned with how they perform. We want objective information about how you perform, and that helps us to follow over time how your brain is working and when it's safe for you to return to play. And also to surveil or look for any clues or evidence that your performance may be falling off, particularly if it's falling off to a point where it could be dangerous to you. So this information is an attempt to help improve the safety, particularly the neurologic health and safety of our combat sports athletes. The beauty of it is that the information is objective. It doesn't matter if physician A or physician C or physician D collects the information. There's a kind of a level playing field. It's objective. We can follow it over time. We can put it in a database, and we can monitor neurologic health and function of our athletes.
You got to take him down.
When we talk about things that make you the best athlete you can be, it's all neurologic in origin. So vision, balance, reaction times, speed of mental processing, all of those things are actually your biggest tool, probably your most valuable tool as an athlete. And we want athletes to start to think of the brain in that way. We want athletes, particularly combat sports athletes, to start thinking about neurologic health across the lifespan. In other words, we want people to be aware of how they treat their brain as a youth athlete, how they can train their brain when they're in the prime of their sport. That most important tool you have as an athlete turns out to be the brain. You can be in great cardiovascular shape, you can have the strongest muscles, you can have a great strategy going into your fight. But if your brain isn't operating on all cylinders, if it's not operating at optimal levels, you won't be as successful as you could be.
If you have any questions, contact the Commission by Facebook or Twitter, or send the Commission an email at csac.dca.ca.gov. On behalf of the California State Athletic Commission, thank you.